In the dead of night, the grand hall of the Parisian mansion lay cloaked in a suffocating darkness, broken only by the flickering dance of candlelight on the cold stone walls. Shadows twisted like living things, swallowing the whispers of servants and the distant echo of a horse's hooves on cobblestone. A pregnant young woman, trembling, clutched her swollen belly, her eyes wide with fear as the general's booted steps drew near. Outside, the city slept, oblivious to the horror unfolding behind closed doors. 5 chained slaves waited in the silence, their breath ragged, their chains clinking like a morbid metronome. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the bitter scent of fear. This night, promised as ordinary, would shatter lives and scandalize Paris, revealing a darkness no history book would dare dwell on. Imagine yourself in her place. What choice could you possibly make? Would you resist or succumb? The general, a towering figure in the rigid hierarchy of late 18th century Paris, was known both for his strategic brilliance and his cruel indulgences. His uniform, dark blue trimmed with gold, gleamed even in the dim candlelight, reflecting a life built on order, discipline, and an iron will that brooked no defiance. In the salons and streets of Paris, whispers of his uncompromising nature had spread, yet no rumor could fully capture the cold precision with which he exerted control. It was in this house, a sprawling hotel particulier along the Rue Saint-Honoré, that the boundaries between wealth, power, and immorality blurred. Each corridor smelled faintly of tobacco, varnish, and the lingering perfume of aristocratic women, a scent that belied the tension coiled within these walls. The young woman, his niece, had once admired him, believed in his guidance. Now pregnant with her first child, she confronted an authority that was no longer protective, but predatory. Her protests, whispered pleas, fell into the cracks of the polished floors unheard, dismissed. The general's plan was simple in execution, yet monstrous in implication. For one night, his niece would serve 5 enslaved individuals, not in teaching or charity, but in acts designed to assert dominance to prove obedience. The slaves themselves were men and women uprooted from distant colonies, their lives reduced to chains, their humanity measured in obedience and fear. Their arrival at the mansion had been noted in hushed tones across Parisian society, their presence both a commodity and a spectacle. They were instructed to carry out menial tasks, yet under the general's decree, each interaction with his niece would be a trial, a twisted rehearsal in power and submission. As the candles flickered and the night deepened, the weight of inevitability pressed down. The niece understood, in that chilling clarity only fear can deliver, that resistance was a dangerous luxury. Her body, swollen with new life, trembled not merely from the physical strain but from the moral terror she faced. Outside, Paris continued its indifferent rhythm, lamplighters lighting lamps, carts creaking along cobblestones. Yet inside, history held its breath. And as the first chains clinked on the stone floor, a sound that echoed like a death knell, the niece realized this night would leave a mark on more than just her flesh. Tell me in the comments, if this were your family, what would you have done? The first knock at the mansion's heavy oak doors rattled through the silent halls, a sound both mundane and ominous, announcing the arrival of the 5. Paris, in the late hours of that winter evening, seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding within its gilded walls. Outside, the chill of November pierced the night, but inside the air was thick with wax, smoke, and the iron tang of fear. The slaves entered, eyes lowered, wrists bound with coarse rope and chains that scraped against skin raw from years of captivity. Their movements were careful, deliberate, as if each footfall might provoke the wrath of the general. The niece watched from the shadows of the grand staircase, her hands resting lightly on her rounded belly. She could hear the subtle creak of their boots against the polished floors, the muted shuffling of bodies, accustomed to subjugation. Their faces, etched with stories of distant lands and forced servitude, carried an unreadable mix of resignation and quiet defiance. Each bore scars faint and pronounced, remnants of lives stolen, testimonies written on flesh. The general's eyes followed every movement, calculating, commanding. Instructions were delivered in clipped tones. The slaves were to set the table, polish the silver, and arrange the tapestries for a banquet that would never be held in joviality. But beneath this veneer of normality lay a crueler design. The niece was to interact with them, to assert herself as host and observer, her compliance testing both her and their endurance. Each glance exchanged, each trembling gesture, heightened the tension. The air itself seemed to shrink, as though the mansion conspired with the general to trap them all in its oppressive silence. The niece stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper, offering assistance in the tasks set before her. The slaves obeyed, their motions meticulous, yet each carried a subtle tension, a contained resentment that could flare at the slightest provocation. Candles flickered shadows across the room, creating shapes that danced like specters of past horrors. The general watched with a satisfaction that was at once imperceptible and undeniable, the corners of his mouth tightening as he observed his niece navigate this intricate, forced choreography. And then, as the first glass was placed on the table, a sudden noise, a door slamming in a distant wing, echoed through the mansion. It was not loud, but in the cavernous silence it carried the weight of a warning. Something, the niece realized, had shifted. The night was far from ordinary. Imagine being there, standing in that same hall. Would you have stayed or run? The niece's hands trembled as she reached for the silver tray, the polished metal biting cold against her fingers. Each movement was deliberate, a performance dictated by fear and the general's unyielding presence. The slaves worked around her, their movements precise yet heavy with unspoken resistance. The mansion's walls seemed to close in, the shadows cast by candlelight twisting into grotesque shapes that leered and shifted with every flicker. She felt the weight of history pressing down upon her, a lineage of obedience and cruelty that her bloodline now demanded she uphold. Her first instructions were simple yet unnerving: serve, observe, and maintain composure. Yet the task was layered with a sinister expectation. Every smile, every nod, every hesitation was measured, judged. The slave's eyes, dark and wary, followed her every gesture. One man paused, his wrist chain rattling softly, and for a heartbeat their gazes locked. She saw recognition there, not fear but a quiet acknowledgement of shared suffering. The air smelled of polished wood, candle wax, and the faint bitter tang of sweat, anxiety, and something darker, something almost metallic. The general hovered in the doorway, a spectre of authority, his shadow stretching long across the marble floors. He did not speak. His presence alone was punishment enough. Every glance from him was a silent command, a reminder that this night was not ordinary. The niece felt the walls of the mansion tighten, the room itself conspiring to trap her in this cruel performance. The slaves moved as if rehearsing for an audience that had already condemned them. An hour passed in this tense choreography, and the niece began to notice small, disquieting details. A whisper behind a tapestry, the subtle clinking of chains in a corridor she had thought empty, a flicker of movement just beyond her vision. The mansion seemed alive, its very stones absorbing and reflecting the terror within. And then a single slip, a dropped goblet, the sharp shatter of crystal against stone, broke the fragile rhythm. Silence fell instantly, heavy as lead. The general's gaze snapped toward the sound, and the niece realized with cold clarity that nothing would remain private tonight. Every action, every misstep would be witnessed and judged. The slaves froze, their eyes reflecting not only fear but a glimmer of rebellion, subtle yet unmistakable. Would you have endured this night, standing under the watchful eyes of both predator and prey? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place? The niece moved through the grand hall with a precision she did not feel, her steps measured, her breath shallow. Each task she performed for the 5 slaves carried a weight far beyond mere service. Every gesture, every bow of the head, became a testament to the twisted hierarchy imposed upon her. The general's presence was like a shadow bleeding into every corner, his eyes tracking, judging, asserting dominion over every living thing in the room. Candlelight flickered on the polished marble, casting long skeletal shadows that writhed along the walls, mocking her hesitation. The slaves obeyed, yet their obedience was not born of respect but survival. Each movement seemed choreographed in silent defiance, small, almost imperceptible acts of rebellion hidden beneath the meticulous performance. A hand lingered on a table edge a fraction too long, a foot tapped a rhythm too soft to escape notice. The niece, sensing these subtleties, felt a tremor of understanding. She was not alone in her dread. Yet to acknowledge it aloud would invite the general's wrath. The moral weight of her compliance gnawed at her. How could she submit to such a plan, knowing the lives around her were ensnared in chains of cruelty? The mansion, with its ornate tapestries and glittering chandeliers, became a theatre of unease. Even the scent of wax and polished silver seemed tinged with something darker: fear, coercion, and the inevitability of human suffering. In a corner, a slave's eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, a spark of silent communication passing between them. The niece realized that obedience was a performance, a delicate balance between self-preservation and moral compromise. The general, meanwhile, remained a motionless observer, his presence a constant reminder that power was absolute and merciless. The mansion seemed to breathe with the tension, the floorboards groaning under the weight of dread, the distant Parisian streets muted and unaware. And yet the niece sensed that the night had only begun. The first trials were completed, but the deeper horrors, the ones that would reveal the true cost of submission, were yet to unfold. A sudden eerie silence fell, broken only by the faint rattle of chains. The niece froze, realizing that even the smallest sound could trigger consequences she could not yet foresee. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, a cold, mournful accompaniment to the unfolding nightmare. Would you have stayed silent or confronted the horror before you? I want to hear your theory in the comments below. The general's eyes glinted in the dim candlelight, a predator observing the intricate dance of fear and compliance. He did not speak at first, allowing the niece and the slaves to labor under a heavy silence, the kind that presses against the chest and constricts the breath. Then, with deliberate slowness, he gave his first command. The niece was to personally administer punishment to one of the slaves, a minor transgression, yet enough to break the fragile veneer of obedience. The room seemed to hold its breath. The air smelled of melted wax, waxen smoke curling upward, mingling with the bitter tang of fear. The niece's hands shook as she approached the chosen slave, a man whose eyes held the history of years stolen from distant lands. His gaze met hers, steady, almost accusing, and in that moment she felt the full weight of her complicity. Each movement became a torment, a choice between rebellion and survival, each second stretching unbearably. The general circled silently, his boots clicking against marble floors, echoing like a death knell. The niece's fingers grazed the rope binding the man's wrists, and the chain rattled sharply, filling the chamber with a sound that seemed louder than the world outside. The man flinched, but he did not cry out. The niece obeyed, her mind a storm of dread and shame, aware that every action was observed, every hesitation noted. The mansion's tapestries seemed to watch her, the painted faces of long-dead aristocrats judging her as she enacted the general's orders. Even as she complied, a quiet rebellion stirred within the slaves. Eyes darted, subtle movements tested the bounds of authority, whispers of resistance brushing against the edges of obedience. The general's satisfaction was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of triumph in his gaze. He relished the psychological torment, the slow erosion of morality under the weight of command. And then, as the first act concluded, the niece realized with horror that this was only the beginning. The mansion, dark and cavernous, seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if alive to the suffering it contained. The night stretched long ahead, each hour promising more trials, more moral compromises, more fear. If you were in her place, would you have obeyed or defied? Tell me in the comments, what would have been your choice in the shadow of such cruelty? The mansion's vast corridors seemed to close in around the niece as the night deepened. Each step she took echoed off the stone walls, a hollow reminder of her entrapment. The slaves moved with silent precision, obeying yet resisting in ways almost imperceptible. A misaligned step, a barely audible sigh, a glance exchanged in fleeting defiance. These small acts of rebellion gnawed at the general's expectation of total control, yet he allowed them to persist, savoring the slow-burning tension he had orchestrated. The niece's heart raced with a mixture of fear and guilt. Every command she executed, every motion performed under the general's watchful eye, felt like a betrayal, not only of herself, but of the human dignity of those she served alongside. The candles flickered, casting long, writhing shadows that merged with her anxieties, making the walls themselves seem complicit in the cruelty. The faint, metallic scent of chains lingered in the air, mingling with the waxy, smoky aroma that clung to the mansion's ancient stone. The general, ever silent, observed from the staircase, a dark sentinel whose presence rendered the air heavy and oppressive. His calculated pauses and measured glances ensured the niece remained in a state of constant unease, aware that any misstep could escalate her suffering or that of the slaves. The mansion became a theater of fear, every detail, flickering light, soft clink of chains, distant footsteps, serving to remind her that nothing was ordinary tonight. Among the slaves, subtle alliances formed. One of the women, older and weathered, whispered under her breath, a quiet rhythm meant only for her companions. Eyes met across the room. A nod passed unnoticed by the general. For the niece noticed these flickers of human connection, fleeting yet defiant, and for a moment a conflicted empathy stirred within her. She realized that even in this orchestrated terror, the human spirit refused to be fully broken. But the general was patient, and patience in his hands was a weapon more cruel than any lash. The night promised more ordeals, each designed to test obedience, morality, and endurance. And as the niece stepped back to tend to the next task, a sudden jarring crash reverberated through the mansion. The sound of a tray tipping, silver spilling, chains clattering. Silence followed, thick and suffocating as all eyes turned toward the disturbance. Would you have found the courage to intervene, or frozen in place under the weight of authority? Imagine yourself there. What would you have done? The mansion seemed to exhale a heavy, oppressive silence as the general descended from the staircase. His boots echoed like distant thunder across the marble floors, each step a reminder of the authority he wielded with terrifying precision. The niece's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as she watched him approach. Tonight, he intended to push the boundaries of obedience further, testing not only her endurance but the slave's capacity for silent defiance. He issued his next command with chilling calm. The niece was to supervise a grueling task, one that would require the slaves to perform repetitive labor under strict scrutiny, while she observed, her every reaction shaping the severity of their punishment. The atmosphere thickened with the acrid smell of sweat and fear, mingling with the cold metallic tang of the chains that had come to dominate the mansion's air. Candlelight flickered across walls adorned with gilded portraits, the painted aristocrat's eyes seeming to judge every movement with silent condemnation. As the slaves moved under her gaze, tension rippled through the room like an unseen current. A young man faltered, his hands trembling as he lifted a heavy silver platter. The general's eyes, sharp and unyielding, caught the smallest hesitation. The niece's hands shook. She understood that a single misstep could bring not only punishment for the man but renewed scrutiny upon herself. Her body trembled between moral resistance and instinctive compliance, a fragile balance that threatened to collapse with every passing second. Meanwhile, subtle defiance persisted among the slaves. One woman let a tray slip slightly, another adjusted a chain just enough to resist discomfort, all while maintaining the guise of obedience. Their quiet rebellion was a language in itself, a rhythm of survival and endurance that the general seemed to relish watching unfold. And then a sudden shriek pierced the mansion, unexpected, raw, human. The niece froze. A slave had stumbled, a candle knocked over, flames licking dangerously close to the tapestries. Panic surged, but the general's gaze held them all in place. In that moment, the niece realized that control was an illusion, and that even the smallest act, a misstep, a slip, a whisper, could ignite chaos. If you were standing there in the shadow of such authority, would you have obeyed or seized the moment to act? I want to hear your theory in the comments below. The candlelight trembled against the walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to mock the niece's hesitation. Each flicker illuminated the mansion's opulent yet oppressive interior, gilded frames, polished wood, and the faint stains of history that whispered of power wielded mercilessly. She felt the weight of expectation pressing down, a suffocating blend of familial loyalty, fear, and moral revulsion. The general's gaze, sharp and unwavering, followed her like a predator's, leaving no room for doubt or defiance. Tonight her task had grown darker. The general demanded that she select one slave to endure a heightened measure of humiliation, a test of obedience for both her and the others. Her fingers grazed the nearest tray, trembling as she realized the impossible choice before her. Each candidate carried a story, a past stolen by chains and the cruel hands of men like her uncle. To comply was to betray them. To refuse was to invite the general's wrath. The mansion itself seemed to respond to her anguish. A distant wind rattled the shutters, carrying the faint, mournful cry of a Parisian street dog. Candle smoke coiled toward the ceiling, thick and suffocating. The faint metallic tang of chains lingered in the air, a constant reminder of captivity. Her eyes met those of the slaves, each glance an unspoken question, a silent plea for mercy, for recognition, for defiance. In that moment, the niece realized the night was no longer about servitude alone. It was about power, choice, and the fragile morality that tethered humanity to compassion. Her hands shook as she stepped toward the center of the hall, her mind a tempest of dread and rationalization. One wrong decision, one hesitant gesture could ignite the general's fury and magnify the suffering in the room. And yet, in the quiet flicker of understanding, she glimpsed the resilience of the human spirit. A subtle nod between two slaves, a slight tilt of the head, a careful, deliberate pause. They were small, silent rebellions, yet they shone like sparks in the darkness. The niece's heart tightened, knowing she too was now complicit, yet aware of the possibility for defiance, however small. Would you have made the choice she faced, knowing each option carried unthinkable consequences? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were trapped in that mansion under that gaze? The mansion's silence had grown thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls held their breath in anticipation. The general stepped forward, his presence filling the hall with an oppressive weight that bent both light and shadow. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, rested on the niece with the intensity of a hawk observing prey. Tonight, he intended to escalate the ordeal beyond anything endured before, to test not only obedience but the limits of courage and morality. He summoned the niece to the center of the hall, where the 5 slaves stood in a rigid line, chains clinking softly, their faces masks of endurance. The general's instructions were precise and merciless. She was to command them to perform acts of servitude and obedience simultaneously, an intricate balance designed to humiliate, break, and test. The niece's stomach churned with revulsion. Each instruction she was forced to voice carried a weight of guilt that pressed on her chest like stone. The slaves complied with mechanical precision, yet beneath their obedience simmered a subtle, almost imperceptible resistance. A glance here, a careful misstep there, a faint sigh, all small acts that defied the general's absolute control. The niece felt her own internal struggle mirror theirs. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, teetered between compliance and the faintest spark of rebellion. The mansion seemed to pulse with the tension, its polished floors echoing the metallic clink of chains, the flicker of candlelight casting moving shadows that twisted like sinister figures. Hours passed in this meticulous, harrowing ritual. Sweat and fear mingled with the faint scent of wax and polished wood, creating an atmosphere heavy with dread. The niece's hands ached, her mind a storm of moral conflict. Yet she endured, knowing that any hesitation could provoke the general's wrath. Then suddenly a misstep, a tray tipped, a chain rattled violently, and the general's eyes narrowed with silent fury. The niece froze. The slaves froze. The mansion itself seemed to shrink around them, the walls tightening, the shadows lengthening. In that moment, she understood fully the cruelty of her position. She was both participant and witness, powerless yet responsible. If you had been in her place, forced to execute orders that defied your conscience, could you have held your nerve, or would fear have consumed you? Imagine yourself there under that unrelenting gaze. I want to hear your answer in the comments. The first light of dawn had yet to touch the Parisian skyline, but within the mansion, exhaustion, fear, and tension weighed like stone. The niece's body ached, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and disbelief at the events she had endured and enforced. The 5 slaves, though obedient in action, carried in their eyes the silent testimony of endurance, anger, and an almost imperceptible triumph of spirit. The mansion, still cloaked in darkness, seemed to pulse with the remnants of the night's cruelty, each shadow whispering of what had transpired. The general observed quietly from the staircase, his satisfaction masked by a composed expression. He had orchestrated his designs with precision, ensuring that every participant, his niece included, was tested in fear, moral compromise, and endurance. And yet, the unintended consequences of human defiance were already surfacing. One of the slaves, a young man with a history of resistance from his homeland, had subtly defied a command, causing a small but significant disruption in the meticulous order the general demanded. The niece noticed the ripple immediately. Her silver platter lay askew, a chain rattled more sharply than expected, and the general's eyes flashed with a mixture of surprise and suppressed anger. Yet he allowed it to pass, his patience revealing a darker intent, to prolong the tension, to observe how far control could be maintained when the human spirit refused to submit entirely. The niece, witnessing this, felt an unfamiliar swell of empathy and with it terror. If she faltered, the consequences would not fall on her alone. The mansion's silence was broken only by the soft clink of chains, the creak of floorboards, and the occasional low whisper between slaves. Each sound seemed amplified in the oppressive space, carrying a weight far greater than the sum of its parts. The niece understood fully that the night had changed everything: the balance of power, the perception of obedience, and the fragile line between cruelty and resistance. And then, as the first grey light of morning seeped through the shuttered windows, a sudden realization struck her. The night's events had been witnessed beyond the mansion's walls. Servants, neighbors, and curious passers-by would soon learn of the scandalous conduct within. Paris, oblivious during the hours of darkness, would not remain silent for long. The shadows of this night would stretch far beyond the mansion, leaving a stain on both family and history. If you were caught in the aftermath of such cruelty, with every action scrutinized and consequences unavoidable, would you have survived or fallen? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if the city was now watching? By mid-morning, the mansion had become a scene of eerie stillness, the aftermath of the night's horrors etched into every corner. The general stood by the grand staircase, composed and imperious, yet even he could not conceal the faint tremor of unease. His niece, pale and trembling, leaned against the cold stone wall, her mind a tangle of fear, guilt, and relief that the night had finally ended. The 5 slaves, though physically unharmed, bore the invisible scars of psychological torment, their eyes carrying both endurance and quiet defiance. Word of the night's events spread through Paris faster than smoke from a candle. Servants whispered in hushed tones, street vendors recounted fragments of what they had glimpsed, and neighbors speculated on the scandalous behavior within the grand mansion on Rue Saint-Honoré. The city, usually indifferent to private cruelties, now stirred with outrage and morbid fascination. The niece's forced compliance, the general's orchestrated cruelty, and the slave's resilience became a story that would be recounted for decades, a tale of authority, fear, and the fragile boundaries of morality. Inside the mansion, the general maintained his composure, but even his rigid control could not erase the subtle consequences. The niece, though spared from physical harm, had endured a trial that would haunt her forever. Her understanding of obedience and power had been irrevocably altered. The line between right and wrong, compliance and resistance, had blurred into a permanent shadow. The slaves, freed from immediate command but not from chains entirely, carried with them a story of survival and quiet defiance that challenged the general's authority, even in its absence. For Paris, the scandal rippled beyond gossip. The story inspired whispers in salons, letters between aristocrats, and debates over the nature of cruelty, power, and familial duty. Historians would later note this night as a chilling example of how absolute authority, unchecked and personal, could fracture both the oppressors and the oppressed. Yet amidst the horror, a fragile spark of resilience endured, a reminder that even in the darkest corridors of human history, the spirit of resistance, however quiet, survives. And as the niece left the hall for the first time unobserved, her mind burdened but alive, one question lingered over the mansion, over the city, and over history itself. Could any of them truly escape the consequences of that night? If you lived in this mansion or in Paris as this unfolded, would you have stayed or run? Tell me in the comments, do you believe this was fate or something far darker?